So Partho, can you please introduce him and just mention the title of his talk, and then we can go live.
Thank you, Shamratta. I sincerely hope I'm audible. Yes. Although it's virtual, yet it's really a great honor to connect with everyone here. We are really grateful and proud that we could bring together so many distinguished and erudite scholars from around the world to have a discussion on humanities beyond disciplines. Yesterday, we had Professor Debashish Banerjee and Professor Anirban Dash. The video is available on YouTube. Today, we are really proud to bring to you Professor Anustup Basu. He is Associate Professor at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's the author of Hindutva as Political Monotheism, Bollywood in the Age of New Media, and the co-editor of Intermedia in South Asia and Figurations in Indian Film. His essays on film, media, culture, philosophy, and politics have appeared in journals like Boundary 2, Semiotic Inquiry, Journal of Human Rights, Postscript, Postmodern Culture, and Critical Quarterly. He was also executive producer of Harbert, the national award-winning film based on Navarun Bhattacharya's novel. This evening, Professor Basu has agreed to speak on affect, neuroscience, and the humanities. Our viewers are requested to leave their comments and questions. We will try to address some of them towards the end of the discussion. I won't delay further, so fasten your seatbelts. We welcome Professor Anustup Basu amongst us. Thank you.
Thank you, Partho. I would like to thank Shamrat, Partho, Pavel especially, and other teachers and students at the Shammilani Mahavidyalaya for organizing this lecture series and inviting me here. I will be speaking on affect, neuroscience, and the humanities. But let me begin by taking up the category that sort of holds the themes together. Let me begin with the human. It is, of course, not just the biological species that we talk about when we talk about human rights, human dignity, or that thing called humanity or humanism. We have certain philosophical, political, theological, or juridical things in mind when we use the term, and when we use the term in a modern sense. The human, in that sense, is a conception. It's a perpetually shifting conception, and that too, a recent one. So what are some of these things? What makes the human? Now, there are, of course, a million answers to that that have been furnished across the ages and across the cultures. But for today, let's stick to the European tradition and identify some of them. Humans, in the first instance, have to be distinguished from animals. Humans are tool-making animals. They can stand erect, unlike other primates, and have prehensile thumbs that can grasp and manipulate objects. Humans, as Hegel would say, are for the most part rational, self-conscious beings that can postpone immediate gratification of instincts and appetites for future interests. In other words, humans can plan and rationalize, order, etc. Humans are political animals. They have been so for a long time, much before Aristotle famously pointed that out. In that sense, humans, unlike other animals, do not come to this world in a state of nakedness. There's a general consensus that all babies do, or at least should, be covered by social identities, juridical protections, citizenship, and human rights right from the moment they're born. A theologian citing Genesis 1.27 would say that humans were made by God in his own image. A caustic philosopher like Nietzsche would retort that modern humans had therefore killed God after making him in his own image. This list, of course, can go on, but let me bring this to a close by broaching a unique human trait, Hopefully, this will let us enter the main discussion. Humans come with a unique time consciousness. We are generally interested in not just who we are, but how exactly we came into being. Humans look upon themselves as becoming, evolving entities. We came from somewhere and should be going somewhere. One of the most influential models in this line of thinking is, of course, the Hegelian one. Here, individual human life becomes a sort of phylogenetic recap of the history of civilization itself. In other words, just as we mature from babies to full-grown adults, human history is itself seen as a progression from infancy to maturity. In Hegel, the infancy of human history was set in India. Youth was in Greece. The individual, let's say midlife, phase was in Rome, and the old age was reached in Hegel's own Prussia. So, in other words, now we know what exactly we mean when we say some place was the cradle of human civilization. The idea, of course, is that we began from a cradle and we are heading towards maturity and ripeness. But here we can start making the story a bit complicated. In the European Enlightenment, it was broadly acknowledged that human beings evolve, but some humans evolve faster and better than others. So this vision of history, as we know, was used to justify some of the worst crimes of human history: colonialism, genocide, slavery, complete subjugation and exploitation of women and the lesser races. Now, in relation to what has been said so far, we can immediately identify some of the common techniques of dehumanization that have preceded genocide and oppression. Comparing humans to monkeys is a very common example. We, of course, know about human zoos of the 19th and early 20th centuries, in which across Europe and America, entire African tribes were displayed. Actually, we don't have to go back that far. In the 1958 World Fair in Brussels, an entire Congolese village was displayed. Then again, as we know, Jews were called amoeba, bacteria, and termites in Hitler's Germany before being sent to gas chambers. The word termite, of course, has been politically used in India recently. It has been used in a chilling manner. Now, where am I going with this? The question of humanity and its myriad complications in the registers of gender, race, sexual orientation, or ethnicity can, of course, be framed in many ways. Today, I'm choosing to frame it as a mind and body problem. As we shall see in a minute, in European Enlightenment thinking, humanity at its finest involved the cultivation of a civilized mind and a social process to ensure that the mind always rules the body. That is, if we return to the metaphor I used a while back, individual or civilizational growth is a story of achieving a certain balance, a certain concord, an equation between the powers of the mind and the capacities of the body. As we grow up, we are expected to normalize and discipline ourselves. We are expected to learn things, follow rules, check our emotions, control our drives, and mitigate our hormonal urges. Normal adulthood, in that sense, means a state of ripeness in which the mind has gained absolute command over the body. Now, if we amplify this metaphor, we also understand why lesser humans have always been infantilized. They are always compared to children, which is the other option to dehumanizing. I use the word infant, keeping its Greek etymology in mind. Infants, beings without language. The infant is she who has no say. In Athenian democracy, three entities had no say: the woman, the infant, and the slave. So in that light, we understand why it took such a long time for women to get the power to vote. Of course, even to this day, patriarchs regularly dismiss the idea of a woman CEO or a woman president, because while they might have impeccable qualifications, women are assumed to be too emotional to take tough decisions. African colonialism and slavery was justified because they were like children. That is, even as physically full-grown entities, the stereotypical African had bodies with unruly hormonal compositions, drives, appetites, and instincts. That was because they did not have the mental capacities to engage with modern disciplines and gain proper control over their actions and bodily proclivities. And then there were others who did not stick to a moral economy of temperance when it came to substances that could disturb the order between the mind and the body. The American Indian was thus the perennial drunk. The 19th century Chinese person was always addicted to opium. The colonial native in India was too otherworldly, engrossed in, traveling in spiritual la-la lands, to take off practical responsibilities of the adult, and so on and so forth. Lesser bodies, infantile bodies, were thus disaffected bodies. And here I briefly introduce the theme of affect. We'll come to that later. That is, these bodies produced unruly energies that could not be brought under the rule of a rational mind. Thus, historically speaking, when it came to global humanity, Europe was imagined as the mind, and the rest of the nations, the rest of the limbs of humanity. The questions of human/humanity and that of the mind and body have always given us anthropomorphic determinations of social order. And so far, we have stuck to Europe, and I will stick to the Western tradition for the most part today. But such imaginations are, of course, not unique to the West. We could, example, broach the metaphysical basis for the caste Varna system in India, outlined first in the famous Purusa Sukta of the Rig Veda, and then ratified later by other texts like the Manusmriti. This was an issuing forth of the four Varnas from the cosmic body or Purusa. The Brahmins from the mouth, the Kshatriya from the arms, the Vaishyas from the thighs, and the Shudras from the limbs. It was thus declared that this sort of ordering just give me a minute. It was thus declared that this sort of ordering will help disaffections in check and produce a harmonious social metabolism. So now I will get to the mind and body question, but before that, let me highlight 3 points of concern. One, first, I will approach this question from the perspective of the humanities as an overall anthropological project. That is, an entire system of knowledge humans set up to study humans and their activities. This was an Enlightenment credo, perhaps most famously declared by Alexander Pope in Epistle 2 of An Essay on Man. The proper study of mankind is man. So the humanities are supposed to constantly tell us about humans, how they form societies, how they write poetry, or how they run economies. So why exactly do we have traditionally scientific disciplines entering this domain? Why do we have neuroscience or the medical humanities? Now, interaction between the humanities and sciences is nothing new, of course. One can, for instance, recall how an entire generation of English poets reacted with dismay as well as elation to Newton's 1704 treatise on optics. Basically, the rainbow was not divine or magical anymore. And then we can think of Darwin, about Lord Kelvin's law of entropy, relativity, space travel, information revolution, etc., etc. But these incursions of science and technology into the domain of the humanities, more often than not, altered worldviews about the human and her cosmic and natural environment. The present interface between neurosciences and the humanities is different, because in this case, neuroscience does not presume to provide secondary knowledge about human condition. That is, tell us about our position in the universe or about the virus that ails us. Neuroscience seeks to do something much more fundamental. It aspires to compel humanists to alter their essential conception of the human in itself. Number two draws from number one. We know that the origins of many disciplines in the humanities were dubious. The discipline of English literature came into being in India and not Oxford or Cambridge, basically to brainwash a native elite to become brown sahibs. Early anthropology and ethnology was largely prompted by the colonial desire to identify the criminal tribes and decide British military strategy, and so forth. But the humanities also always spoke truth to power, not by just by proposing definitions of the human, but by attacking and destroying existent status quoist conceptions of the human. By constantly reinventing and displacing being and subjectivity. The time has come in that vein to seriously ask whether neuroscience compels contemporary humanists to do the same all over again. Is mind what we thought it was? Is the body what it used to be? Is the mind located in the brain? Is the mind synonymous with the brain? Or is the brain a part of the body, just as a part of the overall neurological process involving the central and the peripheral nervous systems? I will get to these questions eventually, but let me begin with a philosophical moment from the 17th century. It inaugurates a dispensation we may call Cartesian humanism in short. In part 6 of his Meditations on First Philosophy, René Descartes, as we know, attempted to solve the riddle of consciousness. Excuse me. Attempted to solve the riddle of consciousness. He did so by proposing a categorical dualism between the mind and the body. The mind, for Descartes, was an immaterial thing, while the body was substantive. The mind was res cogitans, a thinking entity which was its own essence. The body, on the other hand, including the brain, was res extensa, that which exists. This, of course, leads to the famous line in Descartes that we see in coffee mugs and t-shirts: cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Basically, the body might be an illusion brought forth by some deceiving demon, It is consciousness that assures me of my existence. The riddle here, of course, is an old one found across many philosophical traditions. Think of the famous question posed by the Chinese philosopher Zhangzi in the 4th century before Christ. Zhangzi dreamt that he was a butterfly. When he woke and asked himself, I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming that I was a butterfly, or am I a butterfly now, dreaming that I am a man? The Cartesian answer to that would be that the body of the butterfly or that of the man, either of them, could be illusions. But what assures me of my existence is that I am conscious and thus can dream and also think about this question itself. But then in Descartes, there is what is called an interaction problem. If mind is immaterial and the body is material, how do they engage with each other? How does the mind prompt or push the body to do something? Descartes' answer to that, to be honest, was a rather dicey one. He proposed that the pineal gland in the brain was the site where material urges, neuronal signals, stimuli, whatever, passes onto pure mental stuff. So that's the station, the junction where that transfer happens. There have been, across the centuries, a million ways to deal with this problem. I won't get into that. Just to mention one, occasionalism of Nicholas Malebranche, for instance, suggested that it was God. It is God who intervenes at every step to mediate between the mind and the body. So I think of lifting this glass, and God miraculously intervenes to allow me to do that. But I will not go there. What I'm extracting from Descartes' work are two propositions. One, there is a duality and a hierarchy between the mind and the body. Two, the mind is epiphenomenal. There is another, epiphenomenal in the sense that it's beyond phenomenal existence. The mind is beyond our corporeal existence. Now, there is also another important category in Descartes that I will set aside. It is that of the soul. This is something he develops more fully in his other famous work, Passions of the Soul. It is the human who has the soul. The body of the dog, for instance, is no different from an automaton. Descartes didn't use the word robot because it wasn't available, but he could have. And that is because dogs do not have souls. So their entities are in a sense, no different from machines. People have searched for the soul and have tried to determine its exact location in the body. Many of Europe's earliest experiments with human anatomy were prompted by the quest for the soul. Excuse me. In 1901, a person called Douglas McDougall conducted the notorious experiment in which he concluded that the human soul weighs 21 grams. And there is a film starring Sean Penn, which is titled 21 grams, keeping that in mind. Actually, this thing continues today as well. There are contemporary Christian efforts to integrate neuroscience and CAT scan or MRI imaging technologies to integrate them to the quest for the soul. But I'm going to leave that aside because, in a sense, the question of the soul has not been secularized in the modern era, while the question of the mind has. The question of the mind, for the most part, has been a secular one, a practical one. The mind persistently features in our lives as a medical, juridical, as a medical, juridical, or scientific category, not so much the soul. In other words, we don't go to the doctor to be informed about our soul. We can be deprived of voting rights, property rights, or sent to an institution if it is suspected that we have lost our minds. Not so much if people think we have lost our souls. So anyways, let me come back to the Cartesian mind and body problem. There is a duality and a hierarchy between the mind and the body. The mind has to command and regulate the somatic processes of the body. The intellectual history surrounding what I'm calling this Cartesian humanism is an enormous one. I will therefore visit just one moment in Freud and psychoanalysis. I will do that for a reason more than anything else. The recent turn to neuroscience in the humanities has been prompted by a desire to move on from the Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis that dominated literary theory, cultural studies, or film and media studies in the 20th century. I do not wish to open a can of worms about psychoanalysis here. I will simply draw attention to a basic duality that persists in Freud. He struggles at every step to distinguish events of psychosis in the mind from the somatic processes in the body. Consider this sentence from The Interpretation of Dreams, and I quote, "The psychical mechanism employed by neurosis is not created by the impact of a pathological disturbance upon the mind, but is present already in the normative structure of the mental apparatus." The Cartesian question here is obvious. How can one make an ontological distinction between pathological processes and the mental apparatus? What is the mental apparatus made of? Is the psychosis of the mind substantively different from the biochemical processes of the body? Now we have a fair idea about how the brain works: gray matter, white matter, neuronal layers, sensory regions, motor regions, associational regions, etc., etc., etc. Where exactly and at what point can we separate pure mental processes from all of this? Is the mind just a metaphysical name for the brain in that case? If that is the case, then how can we separate the brain from the body and give it a special status? Isn't the brain a continuation of the central nervous system in the body that works in concert with peripheral nervous systems? Freud, of course, is a massive and dexterous thinker. He always, at every step, cautiously spells out that what he is constructing is an analogical or metaphorical description. It is always work in progress, to be revised with new biochemical or anatomical discoveries. A little later in his work, he describes the perceptual apparatus in the brain as a telescope with eyepieces, lenses, and the thing that holds everything together. Now, the Cartesian question here would be, where is the light as pure mental thing coming from, light that goes through the telescope? Is the mind a net effect, an abstraction of the biochemical neuronal processes in the brain and affects in the body? So with this backdrop, let me turn to neurosciences and its contemporary transformational effects on the humanities. There are some simple answers. Neuroscience today claims to have acquired the powers to read minds in terms of trackable data-driven processes. It can erase memories. Perhaps one day can even implant them. It claims to be able to predict propensities towards violence. I think one of the best introductions to this field of engagement in recent times is the anthology of essays called The Neuroscientific Turn, edited by Janelle Johnson and Melissa Littlefield, who is my colleague here at the University of Illinois. In their introduction, Johnson and Littlefield point out a few things. Neuroscientists have questioned the traditional reckonings of the subject and object in the humanities and social sciences. And that is because functional neuroimaging, CAT scans, MRIs, etc., PET, can present anatomical correlates of various cognitive processes. That is, all the processes of the mind have physical correlates in brain function. You can have an exact picture of what happens to your brain while you're watching a funny film, for instance. Not just that, it is assumed that every subjective state has associated neuronal coordinates which can be artificially manipulated to induce an experience of that state. You know, that through molecular biology, data helmets, virtual reality, etc. Some humanities and social science scholars have thus moved to the lab, while others use secondary data from the neurosciences, and they also have cognitive theory as a theoretical backbone. What happens to your prefrontal cortex or hippocampus when you hear Mozart? How can we look at autobiographical writing in this new light? Where should we look for answers to our deepest questions about consciousness, learning, selfhood, and so forth? 3, there is also the question of neuroplasticity. Because neuroplasticity explodes the myth that the human brain becomes a fixed entity once we become adults. Now we know that brain structures can be changed by thinking. Nicholas Carr's 2010 book, The Shallows, draws on neuroplasticity research to argue that the internet is literally changing the brain of its users. Cultural life gets mixed into bodily brain processes. It's not just about how the brain perceives art, but about how art changes the human brain. So how do we reconceptualize the mind and body problem? How do we integrate psyche and soma? This is where I bring in the question of affect. Affect, as we know, is a conceptual shorthand we use to understand embodied experience. That is, a form of experience that we no longer ascribe to the mind and the mind alone, but to the body and a reconfigured mind in relation to that body. We sometimes use common expressions like gut feeling. How do we take it more seriously? We use terms like muscle memory. Virat Kohli plays a cover drive from muscle memory. When the ball is coming at you at 150 km per hour, the response is affective, not a conscious one, not a planned execution. At least, that's what I think. Also, if Virat picks up a new shot, the helicopter shot, for example, I've never seen him play that, the hard wiring in his brain changes. That's the lesson of neuroplasticity. It does not remain the same because it has already forged new neuronal triggers and combinations that were not there before. What is displaced by theories of affect is the Cartesian separation and hierarchy between the mind and the body. Affect as such, in the powerful sense, the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze draws from his work on Spinoza and Bergson, is the refutation of the general Cartesian rule that affection, affectio, is directly of the body, while affect, affectus, refers to the mind and the mind only. So in Deleuze's conception, the mind is not imperial. It is parallel to the body. For Deleuze, therefore, the idea of affect is to affirm the powers of the body beyond the knowledge we have of it, and the powers of the mind beyond the consciousness we have of it. The question of affect thus disturbs and problematizes the ways in which we have understood matters of identity, representation, ideological interpellation, consciousness, or subject formation in the course of the long 20th century. In the light of affect as embodied experience, let us go to the pending question. Is the brain a central organ that sort of houses the mind, understood in a metaphysical sense? So I'm just going to mention a few I'm going to end by mentioning a few interesting formulations that I have come across in this interface between neuroscience and the humanities pertaining to the mind and blood body thing. According to Antonio Damasio, for instance, and the book is called Descartes' Error, human reason operates through interactions between many neurological organizations rather than a single brain center. Intelligence involves mapping and integrating signals from an entire body landscape. A feeling is a mere snapshot of that. Nature would include all external stimuli, genetically engendered responses, and inherited social mores. The body is thus one organism of interactive biochemical and neural circuits, endocrine, immune, and automatic neural components, and physiological operations. What we call the mind is this structural and functional assemblage rather than the brain alone. Damasio's study is based on patients in whom brain lesions have impaired the experience of feelings. He talks about the phantom limb syndrome. Phantom limb syndrome, for those who are not familiar with it, is when you, let's say, a person has an amputated leg, a leg has been cut off, but can continue to feel sensations in that leg which is no longer there. Sensations like, a finger sort of scratching, or a toe is being irritated, or something like that, tickling. So phantom limb syndrome, and I hope I pronounce this well, anosognosia, in which patients do not realize that they are paralyzed and therefore not concerned about their future. In her admirable work, The Transmission of Affect, Teresa Brennan suggests that before the Cartesian biopolitical individual came to the fore, it was quite common to associate feelings with atmosphere. So that is the other thing in Freud, that for him the question of psyche is internalized into the theater of the mind, whereas this habit of associating sunlight or rain or some other thing to and that affecting our moods and our psychological dispositions is a long one. Like, if you think about the name lunacy, the term lunacy we use to indicate madness, it comes from the idea that the phases of the moon, the lunar sort of powers affect our sanity at times. So Brennan defines entertainment, for example, as a neurological phenomenon in which several hormonal or nervous systems, chemical and electrical, are brought into alignment with hormones and pheromones acting as social catalysts. What further complicates matters is the body of evidence in recent research that questions the central assumption that it is the hypothalamus that triggers or arrests the release of hormones. In a general explanation of chemosensory processes, and she sort of gives particular attention to olfaction, smelling, Brennan points out that this scenario reveals a foundational crisis for Freudian psychoanalysis. Because Freudian psychoanalysis presumes an origin of affects that is autonomous of the neurological subject experiencing them. That is, in Freud, the question of affect and psychosis is locked up in an internal theater of the mind. The Freudian unconscious, according to Brennan, can be reconstituted as a theoretical fiction only as an immanent landscape that includes the voluntary, involuntary, sympathetic, and parasympathetic nervous systems. The brain is an interpreter and not an originator of news and information. The unconscious, in other words, extends to the rest of the environment. It's not just in the mind, it's in the body and also in everything that surrounds the body. In recent times, interdisciplinary collaborative projects like that between the neuroscientist M.R. Bennett and the philosopher P.M.S. Hacker and the have attacked in a much more frontal manner than Damasio or Brennan what is known as the endemic binding problem in neurosciences. That is, what is it that holds everything together? Now, Bennett and Hacker's is a two-pronged attack on dualism. Not only do they want to demolish the Cartesian mind, but also foreclose the possibility of inserting the brain as a substitute for the mind. Right? They point out, for instance, that during an epileptic seizure, due to abnormal excitations of the parts of the cortex, the person is temporarily denied some normal capacities like memory, decision-making, emotional stances, or sense of humor, but the abilities to perform routine actions are retained. Bennett and Hacker refuse all previous analogies pertaining to some sort of centrality of the brain here. The brain is neither the computer nor the master scanner or the programmer. It is not a central telephone exchange, and the mind is not the chief telephonist. Excuse me. The purposes of a person are neither the purposes of her brain nor those of her mind. Quote, they are purposes of the person. They are to be understood in terms of facts about human life, social forms of life, antecedent events, current circumstances, agential beliefs and values, and so forth. The metaphors, of course, in this domain get more and more interesting. Edelman and Tononi, they've written this book called The Universe of Consciousness. They are, for instance, Freudians who wish to extend the scope of the unconscious in the light of the neuroscientific turn. So I'm not going into that, but let's, for instance, cite one interesting picture from that study. So memory in their work is non-representational. It is like the melting and refreezing of a glacier rather than an inscription on a rock, and so on and so forth. So this interface between affect theory, neurosciences, and neurosciences changes humanities because it compels increasingly compels us to rethink the philosophical conception of the human, philosophical, political, social conception of the human, and the potentia of the human, what the human is capable of. So this reconceived body of embodied experience has entered into a new covenant with the soul that was thought to have imprisoned it, and with the mind that had apparently ruled it. This new body of neurosciences is a matter of, as a matter of fact, threatens to extinguish the soul and extend itself to the brain, absolving the brain from the metaphysics of the mind. There is no escape from this body, no scope of that out of the body experience that humans, that conscious humans, have sought for ages, from range of techniques from transcendental meditation to virtual reality or drugs, etc. There is no out of body experience. It is because it is as impossible to leave the mind, leave the body, as it is easy to lose one's mind. I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Basu. Thanks a lot for your excellent deliberation. I hope people have learned and they are eager to exchange their ideas. There have been some interesting questions which have come up, which I will read. But let myself begin with the questions. I have certain queries. I want to just start with them. You have, of course, partly answered those queries already, but then I want to clarify certain things. Like, one thing is the question of language.
Mm-hmm.
What is the role of language in the formation of the mind? And also, like I used the word, you have also talked about similar ideas. What is the relationship of the plasticity of the brain with its supposed anatomy? Like, the role of the language in the formation of the mind and its connection with the plasticity of the brain. That is one thing. I just ask 1, 2, 3 questions together, then we can take up some from the questions which have come from the audience. And is there also a problem with the privileging of the body as a concept? As it has been a problem privileging the mind when you try to justify the discourse of affect, emotion, as not located something to the mind, or as something specifically to the body, but the entire thing is manipulated and maneuvered by a certain neurological dispensation. So here you are privileging the body, but the body itself is located in the social. So these are some of the questions. Another thing is the question of literature. Do you think that the literary, I'm not talking about literature per se, but the moment of the literary, or if there is something called literary at all, it has a certain specific dimension to the production of the affect, and what would be its connection with the functioning of the brain? These are some of the questions. You can take these up and then we can proceed with the others. Thank you.
Okay, let me start with the question of language, and it's a very interesting question. But the point is exactly that if someone were to, if you think about the great tradition of philosophical introspection on the question of language, and you can start from Plato and down to Heidegger or Derrida and beyond. It has always been whether we can think without language, or in other words, can there be a mind as an epiphenomenal entity that is prior to a linguistic ordering and meaningfulness that that language imparts to the universe, right? So if you, for instance, take the question of the Freudian unconscious, or rather in early Freud, the question, this thing called it, which is a primal entity that is placed prior to language. That is, language or linguistic constructs don't percolate there. So there has always been a tendency to find an essential mind, that one can trace back to God, or or logos in that sense, but that is prior to the babble of languages. There's the idea of the operations of the mind as a perfect communicability, an original prelapsarian communicability that existed before the babble of languages. So, that is what I can say for the moment. We can obviously carry on the conversation. About what was the second question, Shamrat? Could you just quickly remind me? Oh, what the privileging of the body. Yes, it is. There is something, obviously, which I couldn't cover in this talk. That is, I just laid out what exactly are the stakes in this. And I have my own set of skepticism, my own skepticism about and critical detachment with affect theory or neurosciences. And there are certain perils and entrapments that we can talk about. So yes, a reconceptualization of the body is there is a productive side to it, because it sort of lets us question the mind and its phenomenology and its claims to truth, etc., etc. But it can also bring us, a certain set of problems of its own. And it's like any other turn in the history of the humanities. Before the neuroscientific turn, there was obviously the linguistic turn of the late 70s, and that had its own consequences and reconfigurations. And the third question, again, it's an excellent question about the literary, and and it is too profound a question to be able to answer, from the top of my head. But let me try suggesting something. To me, the value of the literary pertains to terms that we are familiar with, to surprise, to defamiliarization, a kind of an expressive, novel way of seeing the world. So, insofar as that is concerned, it is an enactment of language. The literary is. It's an enactment of language that compels us to change our perceptual systems of our habits, our modes of habituation, of our social understandings. And what neuroscience would simply say is that it also changes our minds, our brains, rather. So, to go back to that theme I was talking about, it's not just about how the mind, the sovereign mind, looks at art or reads literature. It's about how the literary can literally change the brain, the configurations of the brain.
Yeah. Thank you for the answers, for the responses. So now I will ask a few questions from the audience who have asked certain questions. I read them out from the YouTube. And Pavel, can you please highlight? Pavel, you can highlight the questions as I read them on the screen. One by the last
Sure,
question, I
sure, of
begin
course.
with the end. That is easier.
Sure, sure, of course.
But the question by Professor Ashok Mahapatra. He has asked that people like Wittgenstein ascribe to language games the potential for discursivity, poetics, and ethics. How about language then? Does it get relegated in the next scheme of brain-mind experience nexus? So that is one question. I can ask two or three, or you want to respond?
I should respond. Yes, it is most pertinent question. But I think one of the ways to understand this is through the question of the sensuousness of language. Now, there are certain, when we think of the plastic arts, for instance, there are certain forms to which we usually, certain forms we connect to our sensuous being. That is, we have literally a physical feeling when we listen to the Ninth Symphony, or we have a certain, let's say, a haptic experience when we see Mona Lisa for the first time, or the Statue of David, or look at the Sistine Chapel. But I think what becomes central to this nexus of the brain-mind experience nexus is how language can be understood to have a profound sensuous dimension of its own, and that is the only way we can prevent its relegation. That the poetic use of language, for instance, it creates a bodily experience that is transformational. It is capable of literally changing the hardware of the brain, or set up new kinds of neuronal exchanges that were not there before. Now, how far this is useful is a judgment I will reserve, because I don't personally do. That's not my area of expertise, and I don't work in that direction. Thank you, Professor Mohapatra, for that question.
Yeah. Then I ask another couple of questions. Another is Foucault positively by Nikhat Parveen. Pavel, please highlight. Nikhat Parveen, the first question. Foucault positively discards the idea of Freud's theory of unconsciousness as inaccessible and states that human subjectivity builds through outward forces and power relation. And it connected to this, the second one, is the continuation of the same question, I think. So, in what way would you perceive the human subjectivity in the post-human turn?
Well,
so that is the question.
Well, yes. I just mentioned Deleuze. If you think about Deleuze, Guattari, and Lyotard's seminal 1974 book, forgetting the name, and of course Foucault's work, especially those pages on the repressive hypothesis at the beginning of the first volume of History of Sexuality. That is the question. Does the unconscious exist? Is there any or is the question of subjectivity to be radically reformulated? And there was, of course, an entire generation of French thinking in that direction. And yeah, I have nothing to say essentially about that, apart from the fact that I am not a Freudian, and I completely agree with at least some of what comes out of that particular French tradition of interrogating Freud. So insofar as human subjectivity is concerned, Foucault, of course, following I think Bachelard or Blanchot, would suggest that subjectivities are discursive effects, right? From kind of a murmur of discourse that is always around us, and it is language and a linguistic environment, the categories, the concepts that are available to us that constitute subjects. And, in other words, the integrated subject at the ground level does not exist. It's a social phenomenon.
Yeah. Maybe one last question, two questions actually, asked by the same person, Vipasha Bhattacharya. If I may ask, keeping in mind reference points such as the Taoist strain of Zhuang, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correct, Zhuang, as well as Cartesian conceptions of duality, could you see Nick Bostrom's refreshingly logical argument on Libby? And another question, in a simulation state as a relatively non-Eurocentric prism, devoid of the urban myth quality, and thereby a usable model with which to look at the body, between the body and mind. So that is the question. I'm not sure.
Simulation state. This question is actually very easy to answer. I haven't read Nick Bostrom's work, so I will not answer that. But insofar as the last part is concerned, I can consider it as a as a statement from Bipasha Bhattacharya herself. In a simulation state as a relatively non-Eurocentric prison devoid of the urban myth quality, and thereby a usable model with which to look at the volley between the body and mind. That's just that thought. As I said, I haven't read Nick Bostrom book, but that thought sort of reminds me about a current cultural phenomenon that has been on for like 2 or 3 decades of a certain human redundancy in an environment of simulation, postmodern sort of virtual environments, simulated environments, etc. And the thought reminds me of, for instance, the first of the films in the Matrix trilogy, and how that kind of a fear about artificial intelligence, about being entrapped in a kind of a constructed reality and not being able to get out of that bubble, at in various levels, losing the ability to form real life social relationships, not being able to converse with people except through the phone, and things like that. So that those are the things that current concerns about technology and the human condition that remind me of when I look at this question. As to the question itself, like I said, I can't respond because I haven't read the book.
Thank you, Professor Basu. I think we will end this session with these comment and this answer. Thanks a lot. It was really enlightening and stimulating, and the questions were very good. I thank the people who have asked these questions. And now, Pavel, can you please include Professor Paroi? Yeah. So I welcome Professor Abhishek Paroi to today's session. Yeah, Abhishek is a good old friend and a colleague. So he is here now. I'm very happy to host him to this online lecture series. And I think after Professor Basu's lecture,